Why humans are terrified of being truly known. Most people want to be loved, but secretly they fear being fully seen, because being seen completely means being seen imperfectly, and imperfection feels dangerous to the identity humans spent years constructing carefully. So people reveal themselves strategically, sharing enough to feel connected, hiding enough to feel safe, and most relationships exist somewhere inside that fragile space between closeness and protection. Another strange lie humans believe is that intimacy happens automatically with time, but time alone does not create depth. Two people can share years together while barely knowing each other emotionally, because knowing someone requires more than proximity. It requires honesty, and honesty requires courage most people quietly avoid. Another deeply rooted illusion is that people fear rejection only from strangers. Often the most terrifying rejection comes from people already close. A partner seeing weakness and leaving, a friend discovering uncertainty and withdrawing, a family member witnessing failure and losing respect. The closer the relationship, the larger the risk feels. So humans hide most from the people they love most. Another common lie is that vulnerability means weakness, but emotional armor has significant costs. A person sealed behind protective identity cannot fully receive love, because love requires somewhere to actually land. And if every wall remains raised permanently, connection only ever touches the surface, never the person underneath. Another strange thing about being known is how unfamiliar it feels at first. Most people have spent so long performing that genuine exposure creates discomfort, not because something is wrong, but because authenticity became rare enough to feel strange. Another illusion is that people who talk most reveal most, often the opposite. Some people use words to fill space so silence never arrives, because silence allows others to observe, and observation feels threatening to those built entirely on performance. Another deeply believed lie is that humans know what they are hiding, but many people hide things from themselves too. Emotions denied long enough become invisible internally. The grief called tiredness, the loneliness called introversion, the fear called rationality. People become fluent in describing themselves without ever actually revealing themselves. Another common illusion is that being truly known requires constant confession. It does not. Being known happens in small moments, an honest admission during ordinary conversation, a reaction too genuine to edit, a silence that does not require filling. Connection often arrives not through dramatic revelation, but through accumulated small honesty. Another strange lie is that everyone deserves to fully know you. They do not. Discernment matters. Some people are not safe with vulnerability. Some relationships cannot hold depth. And learning to distinguish who deserves full visibility from who only deserves partial access requires emotional maturity most people take years to develop. Another illusion is that being known guarantees being accepted. Sometimes genuine self-revelation ends relationships. Some people cannot tolerate depth in others, because depth in others reminds them of depth they avoid in themselves, and perhaps that is one of the most painful truths about intimacy. Sometimes showing the real self does not invite closeness. It reveals incompatibility. Another deeply rooted lie is that people want honest relationships. Many want comfortable ones instead. Honest relationships require tolerating uncomfortable truths about the other person, about yourself, about the relationship itself. Comfortable relationships allow illusions to persist peacefully, and illusions often feel easier than reality. Another common lie is that emotional distance protects people from pain. It protects them from certain pain, while creating different pain, the loneliness of never being found, the exhaustion of permanent performance, the grief of connection repeatedly approached but never completed. Distance solves one problem while creating several others. Another strange psychological effect is how being seen partially feels more dangerous than not being seen at all. A person who reveals something and receives rejection suffers double pain, exposure and abandonment simultaneously. So many choose guaranteed safety over uncertain depth, never revealing enough to be truly hurt, never revealing enough to be truly loved either. Another illusion is that strong people need nobody to see them clearly. Strength and invisibility are different things. The strongest people are often those who learn to allow themselves to be seen without collapsing, who learn that vulnerability does not erase dignity, that being imperfect in front of someone and remaining present afterward is itself a form of courage. Another lie humans believe is that being known once fixes the fear permanently. It does not. Every new depth of intimacy brings new exposure, new risk, new possibility of rejection. Being known is not a single event but a continuous practice, one that never fully stops requiring courage. Another deeply believed illusion is that people who seem completely open have no fear of being known. Openness and authenticity are different. Some people perform openness while hiding strategically, sharing dramatic surface stories while protecting the quieter, more fragile truths underneath. The things they have never said aloud to anyone. The fears that have no acceptable narrative. The desires that do not fit their identity. Truly hidden things are rarely the obvious ones. Another strange thing about being known is how it changes over time inside relationships. Early connection often feels intense because novelty creates the illusion of depth. Later, when novelty fades, real knowing begins. And many relationships dissolve at exactly that moment, because the performance maintained during attraction cannot sustain indefinitely, and some people prefer beginning new performances to continuing into genuine depth. Another common lie is that people hide because they believe nothing inside them deserves to be seen. Sometimes people hide because they believe too much deserves to be seen, that if someone truly looked, they would find something extraordinary, something they themselves barely understand, and that uncertainty feels more frightening than confirmed emptiness. Another illusion is that animals feel this specific fear. Only humans construct identity this elaborately. Only humans spend lifetimes managing other humans' perceptions of them. Only humans fear not the predator outside. Another deeply rooted lie is that intimacy gets easier the older people become. Sometimes it becomes harder. More walls built, more wounds accumulated, more sophisticated defenses constructed over decades. And yet the longing beneath those walls remains. The same basic human need never disappears. To be seen, not the performance, not the reputation, but the actual person underneath everything carefully built to avoid exactly that, the illusion of control and why humans cannot let go. Control is one of the most persistent human illusions. The feeling that decisions shape outcomes, that effort determines results, that enough preparation can prevent enough danger, and the brain defends this illusion aggressively, because admitting how little control actually exists would feel unbearable. Another deeply rooted lie is that the desire for control is primarily about power. Often it is about fear. Control attempts to create certainty where certainty is structurally impossible. It tries to reduce the gap between what is desired and what reality will actually provide. And that gap cannot be fully closed, no matter how careful the planning, no matter how exhaustive the preparation, no matter how rigidly the environment is managed. Uncertainty remains underneath everything. Another common illusion is that humans have more control over their own emotions than they do. Emotions arise before intention. A person does not decide to feel fear when something threatening appears. The fear appears. Then the person decides what to do with it. The experience of deciding what to feel is actually the experience of deciding what to do after feeling. The original emotional response operates independently. Another strange thing about control is how its absence is processed. When humans lose control over outcomes, they frequently redirect control inward or toward others. Eating disorders involve controlling the body when the environment feels uncontrollable. Micromanagement involves controlling others when internal anxiety feels intolerable. Control rarely disappears, it relocates. Another illusion is that successful people have more control than unsuccessful ones. Successful outcomes combine preparation and favorable circumstance. The circumstance cannot be controlled, only the preparation. Two equally prepared people encounter different circumstances, and different outcomes follow, but the mind tells the successful person their control was responsible for success, and tells the unsuccessful person their lack of control was responsible for failure. The attribution is rarely accurate, but it is psychologically necessary. Another deeply believed lie is that uncertainty only becomes frightening under stress. For many people, uncertainty is chronically physiologically activating. The nervous system treats unknown outcomes as potential threats by default, and remains partially vigilant until outcomes resolve, which means some people spend enormous energy in low-level continuous anxiety simply because the future has not yet occurred. Another common lie is that letting go means not caring. Letting go means releasing attachment to specific outcomes, not releasing engagement with the process. A person can invest completely in an endeavor while accepting that result cannot be guaranteed, can love deeply while acknowledging that another person's choices remain outside their control, can try their absolute best while releasing the illusion that trying their best guarantees a specific result. Another strange psychological effect of control is how it affects relationships. Controlling behavior in relationships often emerges from terror of abandonment. If the other person can be managed enough, perhaps they will not leave. If the environment can be constructed carefully enough, perhaps the feared outcome can be avoided. But control pushes people away, creating the very abandonment it was trying to prevent. Another illusion is that controlling impulses require direct suppression. Suppression requires constant effort, and effort eventually fails. More effective long-term management involves understanding what drives the controlling impulse, what fear underlies it, what need it is trying to meet, addressing the underlying fear rather than fighting the surface behavior. Another deeply rooted lie is that surrendering control feels like giving up. Surrender in this sense means something different. It means fully engaging with what is actual rather than exhausting energy fighting what cannot be changed. It means releasing the demand that reality be other than it is, not passively, but actively. Redirecting energy from resistance toward response. Another common lie is that anxious people simply need to try harder to relax. Chronic control behavior and anxiety are frequently connected to nervous system patterns established during periods where unpredictability was genuinely dangerous. The attempt to relax by trying harder simply creates another form of the same control dynamic. Relaxation is not an achievement. It is what becomes possible when the system stops detecting threat. Addressing the threat signal is more effective than demanding the system ignore it. Another strange thing about the illusion of control is how it interacts with grief. Grief is the specific pain of encountering something beyond control. The loss was not prevented, the relationship ended anyway, the person died despite everything, and grief forces confrontation with the fundamental reality that the most significant things that happen to humans often happen without their consent. Another illusion is that control needs diminish as people mature. Some people become more comfortable with uncertainty through accumulated experience of surviving it. Others become more controlling through accumulated experience of loss. The direction depends substantially on what support was available while navigating difficulty, and whether that difficulty ultimately produced trust in resilience or terror of recurrence. Another deeply believed lie is that spiritual traditions encouraging surrender are asking humans to become passive. They are asking something more difficult, to engage completely. While remaining unattached to controlling the outcome of the engagement, to care deeply without requiring reality to reflect the caring back in a predetermined form. This is not passivity. It may be the most demanding psychological discipline humans have ever attempted to practice. Another common lie is that the need to control decreases once enough security is established. For people with deep historical uncertainty, enough security never arrives subjectively. because the nervous system calibrated to scarcity does not trust abundance. It waits for the abundance to be taken away and remains vigilant accordingly. The amount of external security required to quiet internally generated threat detection is often more than any realistic external circumstances can provide. Genuine security must eventually develop internally, not be granted externally. Another strange thing about control is how creativity relates to its release. Many creative people describe their best work as something that happened through them rather than something they controlled. A state where the internal monitor quieted and something less managed emerged. This experience is common enough across disciplines that it suggests something real about what becomes possible when the controlling function temporarily steps back, when the need to manage outcome weakens, and direct contact with experience itself becomes possible. Not filtered through the anxiety of controlling how it appears. Why humans are never satisfied for long. No achievement satisfies permanently. Most people understand this intellectually. Very few people believe it emotionally. So the pursuit continues. The next accomplishment, the next relationship, the next acquisition, always with the implicit belief that this one will finally complete something. Another deeply rooted illusion is that the adaptation that follows achievement is simply ingratitude. Hedonic adaptation is neurological. The brain establishes new baselines continuously. What felt extraordinary becomes ordinary through repetition. What felt luxurious becomes expected after normalization. This is not character failure. It is how consciousness maintains the ability to continue perceiving rather than becoming permanently overwhelmed by constant sensation. But it also means no external acquisition permanently alters subjective baseline. Another common lie is that dissatisfaction means something is wrong. Dissatisfaction may be precisely what produces movement. The restlessness that prevented ancient humans from remaining in depleted environments, the creative tension that produces innovation, the romantic discontent that inspires expression, the biological drive to reproduce and expand. Permanent contentment might have led to extinction. Dissatisfaction kept the species moving. The difficulty is that the movement no longer navigates the same environments, and the dissatisfaction that once served survival now arrives inside lives that are objectively already sufficient. Another strange thing about satisfaction is how it changes through life stages. What creates satisfaction at 20 may produce emptiness at 40. The external accomplishments once imagined as fulfilling arrive and feel different than expected, and the person must renegotiate what satisfaction even means in this later context, which requires confronting what was avoided when ambition provided clear forward direction. Another illusion is that relationships satisfy differently than achievements do. Relationships also undergo hedonic adaptation. The extraordinary person becomes ordinary through daily presence. The passionate beginning normalizes into familiar routine. This does not mean the relationship is failing, but it requires deliberate cultivation rather than expectation that initial intensity will sustain automatically. Another deeply believed lie is that the problem is the specific goal. If only the right goal were identified, satisfaction would finally arrive. But the pattern repeats across different goals, different careers, different relationships, different cities, different identities. The dissatisfaction is not located in any particular goal. It is partly structural. The mind that seeks external completion for internal questions will continue seeking regardless of how many answers arrive. Another common lie is that people who seem content simply want less. Some people who appear deeply satisfied are not wanting less, they are experiencing differently. Present rather than anticipating, engaged rather than evaluating, finding depth in ordinary moments rather than seeking extraordinary ones. The difference is not smaller appetite, it is different relationship with experience itself. Another strange psychological effect is how comparison affects satisfaction. A salary feels satisfying until a colleague's higher salary becomes visible. An accomplishment feels significant until a contemporary's larger accomplishment appears. Satisfaction is not absolute, it is relational. And in environments of constant comparison, the moving target never stops. Another illusion is that more authentic living would produce permanent satisfaction. Authenticity improves the quality of experience. It does not eliminate adaptation. A person living entirely according to their values still adapts to consistent positive conditions, still encounters mortality, still faces loss, still experiences the impermanence that makes every pleasant condition eventually change. Another deeply rooted lie is that satisfying one level of need creates space to pursue higher ones simply. Higher levels introduce higher complexity. When survival is secure, belonging becomes urgent. When belonging is established, recognition becomes important. When recognition arrives, meaning becomes necessary. Each level resolved reveals the next. The summit keeps extending, not because humans are defective, but because consciousness keeps expanding the questions it needs to answer. Another common lie is that satisfied people have simply stopped caring. Many deeply satisfied people care enormously, but their caring is not organized around an unfilled internal void. They are not caring in order to become okay. They are caring because caring itself aligns with who they actually are. The difference is not the caring, it is the underlying orientation. Another strange thing about satisfaction and meaning is how they interact differently. Satisfaction relates to comfort. Meaning often requires discomfort. A challenging project that demands everything may produce little pleasure while occurring, but significant meaning in retrospect. An easy, comfortable life may produce steady satisfaction, and a persistent sense that something important remained unengaged. Humans need both dimensions, and they exist in tension with each other. Another illusion is that the brain will eventually stop adapting to positive conditions. It will not. This is why experiences that resist adaptation tend to produce more lasting well-being than possessions. Variable experience provides new stimuli. Novel relationships provide new discoveries. Uncertain creative projects provide new challenges. What continues surprising the brain continues registering. What becomes fully predictable becomes invisible. Another deeply believed lie is that knowing about hedonic adaptation changes its operation. Understanding the mechanism provides some capacity to work with it deliberately. Gratitude practices work partly by training attention toward what is already present rather than what is absent. Savoring works by deliberately slowing down positive experience enough that the brain processes it more deeply. Neither eliminates adaptation, but both offer genuine methods for working within its constraints. Another common lie is that ancient humans experience satisfaction differently. As ancient humans faced different obstacles, but they also contained the same neurological architecture, the same tendency to want what was absent, the same adaptation to what became consistently present. Permanent satisfaction has likely never been the default human condition. Perhaps the pursuit itself is partly the point, not achieving completion, but remaining engaged with the particular texture of one particular human life. With all its incompleteness, all its repetitions, all its ordinary moments that will only be recognized as significant much later, or perhaps never. The thing no one tells you about growing up. Nobody tells children the truth about becoming an adult. They are told it will make sense eventually, that things will feel more settled, more understood, more complete. But most adults live with the same fundamental uncertainty children feel. They have simply learned to carry it differently, or hide it more effectively. Another deeply rooted illusion is that adults understand what they are doing. Most adults are making careful guesses, drawing on limited experience, hoping decisions work out, discovering consequences only after actions. The appearance of certainty that children observe in adults is partly performance, partly genuine confidence, and largely the absence of visible hesitation that comes from having made decisions in public enough times to appear comfortable doing so. Another common lie is that identity becomes stable with age. Stability and rigidity are different. Some people develop stable identities that remain genuinely flexible. Others develop rigid identities that defend against continued growth. Age alone does not determine which. What matters is whether the person continued examining themselves honestly, or began defending a fixed image instead. Another strange thing about growing up is how the questions change. Childhood asks what the world is, adolescence asks who I am inside it. Early adulthood asks how to establish position. Middle life often asks whether the position established was actually wanted. And later life asks what it all meant. The questions do not stop arriving, they deepen. Another illusion is that becoming older means becoming braver automatically. Many people become more risk-averse with time, more aware of what can be lost, more conscious of how long recovery takes, more attached to what stability exists. Genuine courage in later life often requires choosing growth despite understanding its costs more clearly than younger people do. Another deeply believed lie is that parents understand their children fully. Parents see their children through filters shaped by their own histories, projections, hopes, unresolved experiences. The child perceived by the parent is always partly real, and always partly a construction shaped by what the parent needed them to be, which is why so many people spend adulthood quietly working to separate their actual identity from the version their family held of them. Another common lie is that the accomplishments imagined in youth will feel the way they were imagined. When the imagined accomplishments arrive, they exist inside actual adult life, with all its complexity and continued uncertainty. The career arrived, but the self that wanted it also changed while waiting. The relationship arrived, but the person inside it is different from the one who longed for it. External arrival rarely synchronizes with internal readiness. Another strange thing about growing up is how it involves mourning. Every stage of development requires leaving something behind. The safety of not yet being responsible, the intensity of first experiences, the belief that there is still unlimited time, the particular version of the self that existed before, a defining loss. Growing up is partly a series of small deaths, each one opening new possibility, each one closing something that was real. Another illusion is that people eventually stop needing validation from specific others. The need for parental approval particularly often persists far into adulthood, even after parents are gone, even after conscious commitment to independence. The internalized voice wanting approval from the original source remains, and sometimes only becomes visible through the emotional disproportionate response to its absence. Another deeply rooted lie is that the hardest work of psychological development happens before adulthood. Some of the most difficult inner work only becomes possible after enough experience accumulated. The patterns cannot be seen until they have repeated enough times to become undeniable. The defenses cannot be released until what they were protecting has been sufficiently understood. Some people only begin genuinely knowing themselves at 40, others at 60. Psychological development does not end. It only changes what it is working with. Another common lie is that successful people figured something out that others are missing. Successful people navigated specific circumstances with specific abilities that happened to align, and they experienced failures invisible from outside. The appearance of having figured things out is largely retrospective narrative. The experience from inside usually contained far more confusion than the story later told about it. Another strange thing about adulthood is how it reveals what childhood did not prepare anyone for. The sustained maintenance required to keep anything valuable alive. Relationships, health, work quality, internal clarity. Nothing remains at its best without continuous attention, and much of adult life involves the quiet discipline of that maintenance, the daily choices that will only reveal their significance much later. Another illusion is that wisdom arrives naturally with age. Wisdom requires reflection. A person who lived 60 years while avoiding self-examination is not necessarily wiser than someone who spent 20 years looking honestly. Age provides material. Reflection transforms material into understanding, and reflection is chosen, not guaranteed. Another deeply believed lie is that people eventually stop wanting things they cannot have. The longing for unlived lives persists. The path not chosen continues existing in imagination. The version of the self that might have become something different remains as a ghost, not haunting exactly, but present, a reminder of contingency, of the arbitrary nature of which life out of many possible lives happened to occur. Another common lie is that people grow out of needing connection. Isolation becomes more painful with age for most people, not less. The network of meaningful relationships requires more effort to maintain than it did when life created proximity automatically. And its absence becomes more palpable as time reduces naturally who remains. Connection is not a young person's concern, it is a lifelong one. Another strange thing about growing up is that it never fully concludes. There is no moment of arrival, no point where development is complete, no age where all questions are answered, and remaining life is simply the living of answers already found. The process continues until it stops entirely. And perhaps the most honest thing anyone ever learns is this: nobody has it completely figured out. Nobody is as certain as they appear. Everyone is navigating uncertainty with whatever tools they happen to develop, improvising continuously, and somehow continuing anyway. Which may be the most human thing of all, not the certainty, not the answers, but the continuing. The hidden reasons humans seek power over others. Power is one of the most misunderstood human motivations. Most people believe they want freedom, but many unconsciously want control over situations, over people, over outcomes, not because humans are evil, but because control reduces fear. And fear drives far more behavior than people willingly admit. Another strange lie humans believe is that people seek power mainly for selfish gain. Often they seek it because powerlessness once felt unbearable. A child who felt invisible may become an adult who compulsively needs influence. A person who felt controlled may spend adulthood ensuring nobody controls them again. Power becomes psychological protection, accumulated against remembered helplessness. Another deeply rooted illusion is that power only looks like authority. Power takes countless quiet forms: emotional withdrawal to punish, silence designed to create anxiety, constant criticism that slowly weakens confidence, praise given and removed strategically. Controlling behavior rarely announces itself as control. It often disguises itself as love, concern, or rational expectation. Another common lie is that powerful people feel powerful internally. Many people driven by control feel deeply powerless inside. The external dominance compensates for internal fragility. The louder the control, often the quieter the confidence beneath it. Another strange thing about power is how it disguises itself as virtue. A person controlling others may genuinely believe they are helping, protecting, guiding, correcting. The motivation remains hidden even from themselves. This is why confronting controlling behavior often creates genuine shock in the person doing it. They did not recognize it as control, they recognized it as care. Another illusion is that only certain personality types seek power. In reality, humans seek power in different areas with different intensities. Some need professional control, some need relational control, some need control over their own image. The specific domain varies. The underlying mechanism remains similar. Uncertainty feels threatening. Control reduces uncertainty temporarily. Another deeply believed lie is that power corrupts only weak characters. Power changes brain chemistry measurably. Access to control reduces empathy gradually, not because the person was secretly bad, but because authority physically alters perspective. The powerful literally begin perceiving others differently, as less dimensional, less complex, less worthy of consideration. And perhaps this is why absolute power has never produced consistently good outcomes. The mechanism is neurological, not merely moral. Another common illusion is that people with power over others feel satisfied. Control provides temporary relief from anxiety. Then anxiety returns, demanding more control, more compliance, more certainty. Power rarely satisfies what originally created the hunger for it. Another strange psychological pattern is how people raised in powerless environments often develop two opposite responses. Some seek power aggressively later in life. Others become conflict avoidant almost completely, comfortable with powerlessness because powerlessness feels familiar. Both responses emerged from identical emotional histories, processed differently by different nervous systems. Another lie humans believe is that fair systems eliminate power abuse. Systems are designed by humans with human psychological patterns. Those with access to systems frequently use access to maintain advantage, not always through conscious corruption, but through unconscious assumptions about who deserves what, who is taken seriously, who is interrupted, who receives forgiveness automatically. Power shapes perception in ways the powerful rarely recognize from inside the experience. Another deeply rooted illusion is that loving relationships contain no power dynamics. Every relationship contains power. Who needs the other more? Who withdraws first during conflict? Who defines what is normal? Who controls shared narrative? Healthy relationships contain power dynamics that shift flexibly. Unhealthy ones contain power that flows only in one direction. Another common lie is that submissive people want no power. Often submissive behavior itself becomes a form of control. Helplessness that creates obligation, passivity that generates guilt, emotional fragility that prevents others from being honest. Power moves in every human interaction, sometimes loudly, sometimes through apparent weakness. Another strange thing about power is how it changes the experience of time. Powerful people often feel urgency justifies behavior. The ends become easier to justify through means. Small ethical compromises accumulate. And eventually behavior that would have once felt wrong feels entirely reasonable, because power slowly rewrites internal moral standards. Another illusion is that humans can identify manipulative power clearly in real time. Most manipulation is recognized only in retrospect, because skilled manipulation does not feel like manipulation while occurring. It feels like genuine care, reasonable expectation, natural consequence. The clarity arrives later, sometimes years later. Another deeply believed lie is that power always flows from strong to weak. Emotionally, power flows in complex directions. A person who refuses to need anyone controls others through unavailability. A person who performs endless suffering controls others through guilt. A person who threatens to collapse controls others through fear. Weakness, performed strategically, becomes its own form of dominance. Another common illusion is that losing power feels like losing status only. It often feels like losing identity. Because for people who organize themselves around control, powerlessness feels like dissolution, like ceasing to exist in a meaningful way. This is why power is defended so desperately, and not always for practical reasons, but existential ones. Another strange thing about power and fear is how interchangeable they become. Fear often looks like anger. Anger often leads to control attempts. Control attempts often provoke resistance. Resistance increases fear. A cycle so automatic most people inside it never identify the original emotion clearly. Another lie modern culture spreads is that ambition and power hunger are identical. Ambition can exist without needing to dominate others. But power hunger specifically requires hierarchy, requires someone beneath, and sometimes the most dangerous people in systems are those who cannot distinguish their ambition from their need to diminish others. Another deeply rooted illusion is that power becomes unnecessary once security is established. For people with deep historical helplessness, security never fully feels real. Because the nervous system learned threat too young, it continues scanning for danger even inside safety, and continues needing control even when external circumstances no longer require it. Another lie is that humans would choose equality if given the opportunity freely. Equality requires tolerating others having power similar to your own. It requires trusting that you remain safe without dominance, and for many people, that level of trust was destroyed long before adulthood. What looks like preference for hierarchy is often unhealed fear about what happens without it. How other people shape who you become, without you realizing. Most people believe they chose who they are. But identity is largely collaborative, built through contact with specific people at specific moments, shaped by what others reflected back, damaged or healed by how others responded. And the human who exists today carries countless invisible fingerprints from people they have barely thought about in years. Another strange lie humans believe is that early relationships only affect childhood. Early attachment patterns reorganize continuously throughout life. The template formed with first caregivers influences how safety feels inside later relationships, how conflict is processed, how intimacy is approached, how abandonment feels. Early experiences do not end. They continue operating as emotional background architecture. Another deeply rooted illusion is that people consciously choose their closest relationships. Familiarity drives attraction powerfully. People are often drawn to emotional dynamics resembling what they originally learned to navigate, not because they want to repeat patterns consciously, but because familiar emotional territory feels navigable in ways unfamiliar territory does not. Another common lie is that teachers and mentors only teach content. Significant others teach the self. A teacher who believed in someone's intelligence may have permanently altered what that person believed was possible. A mentor who modeled equanimity may have rewired how someone processes difficulty. A stranger who witnessed someone honestly at a critical moment may have changed a trajectory completely. Most people never realize the extent of this transmission. Another strange thing about social influence is how invisibly it operates. Group membership quietly reshapes language. Adopted vocabulary creates adopted frameworks. Adopted frameworks change perception. A person who joins a new professional community, religion, or social circle gradually begins perceiving reality through that community's assumptions, often without noticing the shift while it occurs. Another illusion is that humans are most influenced by people they consciously respect. Unconscious influence often flows from people who created strong emotional responses, not only admirable people, people who frightened, humiliated, abandoned, unexpectedly cared for during vulnerability. Intensity of emotional impact matters more to unconscious learning than quality of moral character. Another deeply believed lie is that influence decreases once relationships end. Internalized voices persist after external relationships conclude. A critical parent continues speaking decades after the relationship changed. A loving mentor continues providing courage years after they died. Significant people become internal characters, continuing to shape choices long after they are physically absent. Another common illusion is that people influence each other symmetrically. Influence flows asymmetrically constantly. One person listening intently while another speaks changes what the speaking person discovers about themselves. One person remaining emotionally regulated during another's crisis alters what the crisis person believed was possible. Presence itself is influence, and people rarely know which moments of their presence created lasting changes in others. Another strange psychological effect is how groups suppress individual perception. A person surrounded by people who agree on something begins doubting private contradicting observations, not through obvious pressure, but through the quiet erosion that comes from repeatedly being the only person seeing something differently. Humans are neurologically calibrated toward social consensus. The isolated perception feels unstable. The shared perception feels like truth. Another lie humans believe is that education is primarily about information. Education is substantially about constructing what kinds of questions feel thinkable. Teachers who encouraged curiosity created minds oriented toward questions. Teachers who rewarded compliance created minds oriented toward correct answers. Both transmitted knowledge, but they transmitted entirely different relationships with knowledge itself. Another deeply rooted illusion is that people always know who influenced them most. The most formative influences are often not the most obvious ones, not the famous person who inspired from distance, but the neighbor who listened without judgment once, the peer who laughed at a specific joke and made someone feel genuinely funny for the first time, the adult who expressed confidence in someone when no one else did. Small moments with specific people change internal architecture more than large dramatic events sometimes. Another common lie is that only family shapes fundamental identity. Peer relationships during adolescence reorganize identity profoundly. The group that accepted or rejected, the friend who saw potential before anyone else, the relationship that first made vulnerability feel either safe or catastrophic. Adolescent social experience frequently shapes adult relational patterns as significantly as early childhood does. Another strange thing about interpersonal influence is how it can heal old wounds. Relationships later in life sometimes revise earlier emotional learning. A consistently trustworthy relationship revises the assumption that trust always eventually breaks. A partner who remains during weakness revises the assumption that imperfection requires concealment. A friendship that tolerates honesty revises the assumption that truth risks connection. People can become updated through relationship. Old internal templates do not remain fixed permanently. Another illusion is that influence flows only from people to people. Physical environments shape people significantly. Cities create different social rhythms than rural landscapes. Spaces designed for specific activities begin to feel appropriate only for those activities. A person changes their own behavior based on environment automatically, and environments are themselves designed by other humans with specific intentions. Influence surrounds humans in every dimension, not only through direct relationship. Another deeply believed lie is that you can identify clearly which parts of yourself are authentically yours. What feels most personal is often most socially constructed. Language given by culture, values transmitted by community, desires shaped by exposure to specific examples of desirability. The self is partly a reflection of every human ever encountered, which makes complete individual authenticity perhaps impossible to achieve, and perhaps unnecessary to achieve. Perhaps the more important question is not which parts came from inside, but which parts, wherever they came from, feel genuinely worth continuing to carry. The strange comfort humans find in suffering. One of the most uncomfortable truths about human psychology is this: suffering is familiar, and familiarity creates a strange form of comfort, not pleasure, but predictability. And for many people, predictability feels safer than unfamiliar happiness, because happiness is uncertain. It might end, it might disappoint, it might require things they do not know how to sustain. Pain, at least, is known. Another deeply rooted illusion is that humans always move toward feeling better. Sometimes people move toward feeling familiar instead. A person raised in emotional chaos may unconsciously recreate chaos as an adult, not because they enjoy it, but because calm feels incomplete somehow. The nervous system adapted to turbulence and treats stability as suspicious. Another common lie is that suffering always arrives from outside. Much suffering is internally generated. Rumination, self-criticism, anticipatory anxiety. The mind replays painful events voluntarily. It generates worst-case scenarios for futures that may never arrive. It compares present reality to imagined alternatives constantly, and sometimes the internal suffering exceeds anything external circumstances actually produced. Another strange thing about familiar suffering is how it shapes identity. People sometimes organize entire identities around difficult experiences. The person who suffered, the person who was wronged, the person who never recovered, not dishonestly, but because the story gave meaning to something that otherwise felt only chaotic and random. Pain made into narrative becomes bearable. Pain without narrative feels only senseless. Another illusion is that people choose suffering consciously when they remain inside it. Most of it operates beneath awareness. The choice to stay in a painful pattern is rarely experienced as choice. It is experienced as inevitability. This is just how relationships feel. This is just how I am. This is just what life does. The pattern feels like reality rather than a selected response to reality. Another deeply believed lie is that humans process grief linearly, moving from pain forward toward recovery in steady progression. Grief rarely moves linearly. It returns, resurfaces during unexpected moments, intensifies before softening, and perhaps expecting linear recovery itself creates additional suffering. People begin believing something is wrong with their healing, when actually the complexity of the process was simply never explained clearly. Another common lie is that humans never find secondary benefits inside suffering, but secondary benefits exist frequently. Suffering sometimes earns care and attention from others. Suffering sometimes permits avoiding responsibility. Suffering sometimes justifies not attempting things that might end in failure. None of this means suffering is chosen consciously for these reasons, but the secondary benefits can make certain painful patterns harder to release than they would otherwise be. Another strange psychological pattern is how humans bond through shared suffering. Collective hardship creates deep social cohesion. This is partly why difficult shared experiences create some of the most meaningful relationships. Military service, navigating illness together, surviving shared loss, pain shared becomes connection. And perhaps this partly explains why some people unconsciously create shared difficulties inside relationships, not to harm, but to generate the bonding that difficulty reliably produces. Another illusion is that healing always feels like relief. Sometimes healing initially feels like loss. The identity built around suffering begins dissolving. The relationships organized around shared pain begin shifting. The familiar emotional landscape changes, and the person may mourn even as they improve. Because healing requires releasing something that organized their life for years. Another deeply rooted lie is that people who seem to enjoy drama are simply immature. Often they are highly anxious people for whom drama provides emotional regulation. Drama creates adrenaline. Adrenaline creates focus. Focus temporarily reduces background anxiety. The chaos is uncomfortable, but it is less uncomfortable than sitting with formless, sourceless dread. Another common lie is that people who return to difficult relationships simply do not know better. Often they know clearly. But familiarity reduces perceived risk. The known suffering of the existing relationship feels manageable. The unknown suffering of starting again feels potentially worse. The mind calculates suffering in relative terms, not absolute ones. Another strange thing about comfort in suffering is how it interacts with hope. Some people maintain painful situations specifically because hope remains alive. Hope that things will change, that the person will change, that the situation will eventually shift. And hope, even inside pain, feels more endurable than hopeless certainty. The suffering continues, not despite hope, but because of it. Another illusion is that eliminating all suffering would create happiness. A life without any difficulty would likely feel meaningless. Humans find purpose through overcoming obstacles, through enduring and continuing anyway, through discovering that certain pain was survivable after all. Absolute comfort tends not to produce fulfillment. It tends to produce restlessness. Another deeply believed lie is that humans seek pleasure as primary motivation. Avoidance of pain often drives behavior more powerfully than pursuit of pleasure. The decision is less often about moving toward what feels good, more often about moving away from what feels threatening. And this means many life choices are shaped more by fear than desire, even when they look like ambition from outside. Another strange thing about human suffering is how it connects to meaning. Experiences of significant suffering often produce the deepest philosophical and spiritual development, not because pain is good, but because pain disrupts automatic living. It forces confrontation with questions otherwise easily avoided. What matters? What is real? What remains when everything comfortable disappears? And sometimes those questions produce understanding that ordinary comfort never could. Another common lie is that the goal is to feel good always. Perhaps the goal is to feel real always, to exist fully inside the actual texture of human experience, which contains both suffering and joy, and which cannot be fully experienced from behind the protection of constant escape. The psychological weight of living in an age of too much. Humans evolved in conditions of scarcity. Information was rare. Choice was limited. Stimulation required physical seeking. Now information is infinite. Choice is overwhelming. Stimulation arrives without any effort at all. And the nervous system that evolved for scarcity is navigating abundance it was never designed to process. Another deeply rooted illusion is that more options create more freedom. Research consistently shows that excessive choice increases anxiety. When options are few, decisions feel manageable. When options are infinite, every decision carries invisible weight. The unselected options accumulate psychologically, creating the persistent feeling that a better choice was always possible somewhere else. Another common lie is that constant access to information creates better understanding. Information volume increased, depth of processing decreased. A mind consuming hundreds of stimuli daily processes each one less deeply. The brain adapted through skimming rather than absorbing, and gradually the capacity for sustained attention weakened, not because humans became less intelligent, because the environment rewarded different cognitive patterns. Another strange thing about modern abundance is how it generates guilt. Previous generations survived with less. Current conditions provide more than most humans historically could imagine. And yet dissatisfaction is widespread, which creates a secondary suffering. Not only feeling unhappy, but feeling guilty about unhappiness given apparent material advantage. The unhappiness therefore cannot be admitted clearly, and buried unhappiness compounds quietly. Another illusion is that comparison was always this psychologically costly. For most of human history, comparison was limited to people within direct proximity. The village, the neighborhood, the visible community. Now comparison extends globally and continuously. The reference group expanded from dozens to billions, and the brain that evolved to calibrate relative status within small groups is now attempting to process status relative to the entire human population simultaneously. Another deeply believed lie is that people can manage unlimited information input without psychological cost. Constant exposure to global suffering creates measurable emotional dysregulation. The nervous system cannot distinguish between immediate local threat and distant mediated representation of threat. Stress responses activate regardless. A person who has never experienced war personally may carry chronic physiological stress from repeated exposure to war imagery. The body responds to what the mind encounters, even through a screen. Another common lie is that convenience removes friction. Friction sometimes provided structure. Waiting created anticipation that made arrival meaningful. Difficulty created the contrast that made ease satisfying. Obstacles provided the resistance that made accomplishment feel real. When friction disappears completely, meaning sometimes disappears with it. And the person surrounded by convenience begins searching for artificial resistance, creating problems to solve because pure ease feels somehow insufficient. Another strange psychological effect of modern abundance is identity overload. Previous generations had fewer identity options. Social role was partly determined by geography, class, and family. Now identity is theoretically open, and any lifestyle, any value system, any presentation, the freedom is real. But unlimited identity construction is also exhausting. The self requires continuous curating, and the curation never feels definitively complete. Another illusion is that having everything available makes gratitude easier. Gratitude requires contrast. A person who has always been warm cannot fully appreciate warmth. A person with constant entertainment cannot fully appreciate a good story. The mind adapts to consistent conditions and treats them as neutral baseline, making gratitude for abundant conditions genuinely psychologically difficult, not impossible, but requiring deliberate cultivation that contradicts automatic adaptation. Another deeply rooted lie is that people function better when perpetually stimulated. The nervous system requires actual rest, not passive stimulation, not the semi-rest of entertainment, genuine cognitive quiet. And for many people, that level of quiet has become nearly inaccessible. Withdrawal from stimulation initially produces restlessness, anxiety, and discomfort. Symptoms so uncomfortable that many return immediately to stimulation, never reaching the depth where actual restoration occurs. Another common lie is that technology is neutral. Technologies are not neutral. Every medium shapes the perception organized through it. Photography changed how humans understand memory. Film changed how humans understand narrative. Social media is changing how humans understand the self. The tool shapes the user as much as the user shapes the tool. And new technologies arrive faster than the cultural understanding needed to navigate them wisely. Another strange thing about abundance is how it affects relationships. When people are easily replaceable, investment decreases. Dating culture changes when alternatives remain perpetually available. Why tolerate difficulty in relationships when easier options theoretically exist elsewhere? Depth requires accepting limitation, accepting that this specific person, with specific imperfections, matters more than theoretical alternatives. And perpetual availability of alternatives makes that commitment psychologically harder. Another illusion is that humans naturally self-regulate technology use. The systems delivering stimulation are engineered specifically to defeat self-regulation. Variable reward schedules, endless scroll, continuous notification. These designs exploit neurological patterns that evolved in entirely different environments. The person struggling to put the phone down is not weak. They are experiencing something closer to a rigged game. Another deeply believed lie is that humans will adapt naturally to information overload. Some adaptation is occurring. Attention shortened. Multitasking increased. Depth processing decreased. The adaptation is real, but whether the adapted human is better or simply differently limited remains genuinely unclear. Another common lie is that digital connection eliminates loneliness. Contact increased dramatically. But many people report feeling more isolated than previous generations, because contact without depth does not satisfy what loneliness actually needs: being seen genuinely, being heard patiently, being present with another person fully. These experiences became rarer as contact became faster. Another strange thing about modern abundance is how it interacts with mortality. Previous generations organized meaning partly through necessary struggle. Surviving difficulty created purpose automatically. When survival is less immediately demanding, humans must actively construct meaning, and constructing meaning deliberately is genuinely harder than discovering it through necessity. Many people find themselves materially comfortable and psychologically adrift, not ungrateful, but genuinely uncertain what they are supposed to organize their existence around. Another deeply rooted illusion is that more freedom always improves well-being. Certain constraints create the structure within which meaningful experience becomes possible. Commitment creates depth, limitation creates mastery, scarcity creates appreciation, and a person freed from all constraint does not automatically flourish. Sometimes they become paralyzed, unsure what to choose from infinite options, unsure what choosing means when everything remains reversible.